Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. It's great to be discussing education issues in this chamber, but I've been struck what lacklustre debate we've seen in the chamber. It's no passion from any of the members. Seems like they're not interested in the bill, because what education is, it's vital to our future as a country, as a people and as an economy. My vision is an education system which sets up our young Kiwis, be they in primary or university or polytechnics, so we can deliver a smart economy. I was just looking out my office window today at all those logs down there at the Wellington waterfront. Why are we still exporting raw logs in 2011? Why aren't we using our smarts to turn that into high-value wood products? Why aren't we leveraging that clean green brand and actually build a smart economy? And this bill, while it's good to be discussing education in this chamber, it's about tinkering, Mr. Speaker. This isn't visionary, and it's not going to bring about the big changes we need to really deliver a smart economy and smart people. But here's this bill to debate today. So I'd like to first of all acknowledge the submitters to the Select Committee. There weren't a huge number of them, but I'd like to acknowledge them. I'd like to acknowledge the officials, the chairman of the committee, other members who heard the submissions on the committee. I'd like to acknowledge them. What this bill does, Mr. Speaker, it does a number of things, from strengthening the regulation of private training establishment. It gives the Ministry of Education more power to issue directives to tertiary providers about they charge student services levy. It establishes the new Crown agent, Education New Zealand, to replace 3 former agencies. And lastly, it makes it easier for the Ministry of Social Development to administer student allowances by giving them the power to request enrolment information. Much of that isn't controversial whatsoever. The Green Party could support these mostly common sense or beneficial clauses and parts to the bill, but the fact is the Green Party will not be supporting this piece of legislation because of what you see in clauses 25 to 29, which is the student service levy clauses. I'm going to outline, Mr. Speaker, why the Green Party is opposed to these clauses, why we would have liked for these clauses to have been removed, and the good reasons why they should have been removed, and then we could have had the whole Parliament voting for what would have been a pretty good, pretty common sense, pretty non-controversial bill. Now, the reasons why the Green Party is opposed to these clauses is because there was no evidence presented that this is a significant problem of rising fees or this is going to continue into the future, whilst acknowledging there has been recent rises which have been significant. But of course, both parties avoid the real issue. Why are we seeing student service fees rising so high? And the reason, of course, is because governments, whether they're red or blue, have both failed to properly fund tertiary education, put in place policies like the fee maxima, which have been good on one side, but have meant that institutions have had to go out and get revenue sources from other ways, like student fees. The bill gives Stephen Joyce, the Tertiary Education Minister, far too much power to issue directives to what institutions can do, and the Green Party does support greater autonomy for our tertiary institutions. And lastly, what we're going to see is a worse outcome for our students. So clauses 25 to 29 give the Minister power to direct via regulation the categories of student services that the institution may make available. The council of the institution must ensure that fees fixed under the schedule relate only to the types of student services that fall within the categories. So in a nutshell, the Minister is going to be deciding what categories independent institutions can charge their students and fund. Now, the Green Party is concerned about rising fees. We don't think rises of up to 600% in Canterbury are on. Some have been significant, but what we heard from the officials with the regular impact statement, and they said quite clearly there's no indication recent rises are going to be the norm. I look at the Auckland University submission, and they say the bill as presented seeks to address a number of problems that do not exist, and that, even if they were to exist, would be capable of efficient and inexpensive resolution without the need for the approaches suggested in this bill. You look at the submission from Victoria University, where they say this bill is about second-guessing their roles and responsibilities to their student and their independent power at all. So there's no evidence we needed legislation to deal with the problem, and the fact is it avoids the real issue, why institutions feel they have to keep raising student fees, and it's the lack of funding by this government and the last government. It's the fee maxima policies. It's the fact that the budget for tertiary education hasn't grown a cent under the national government, yet we know that inflation is rising at a 20% increase, the highest in 21 years. We're seeing a country that spends $3,000 less than the OECD average on our students. Yet in Australia, who we're trying to catch apparently in terms of their economy and their performance, who've poured $5.7 billion extra into the tertiary sector, we've put no extra money in, requiring institutions to raise their fees. So there's no need for this law. It fails to address the real problem, and it gives the Tertiary Education Minister, Stephen Joyce, much too much power. Now, of course, what I believe is what these clauses 25 to 29 do are in fact in contradiction with Part 14 of the Education Act, which gives institutions institutional independence. Now, the governing party in opposition riled on about the nanny state and the perils of regulation and red tape coming from this government, but here they are deciding to put regulatory powers on the shoulders of one man to decide who and what and how fees should be levied on students. Now, at the same time we're debating the other bill, which we can't name in this chamber, auspiciously in the name of student choice and student freedom, here's the National Party, supported by the Labour Party, telling students how their student fees will be raised and what they can be paid for, what they can be used for, what they can't be used for, what they can be used for. Now, if that isn't nanny state, I don't know what is. The government telling institutions what they can spend their own money on. Now, in the environment of this legislation, which cannot be named in this chamber, what we're seeing is student associations going to collapse. We're seeing the need for agreements to be signed between institutions and student associations, as is the case at Auckland University now, and this does put a serious constraint on their funding ability, and the fact that most of these, or the vast majority of these services, are critical to a good university environment, are critical to good pastoral care of our students, and ultimately critical to good educational and economic outcomes. Mr. Speaker, we support greater openness and transparency and greater student involvement in setting the student levies, but again, it's left up to regulations. There's no detail in this bill. We think that should have been enshrined in this legislation to make sure the principles of openness and transparency are actually going to be delivered by the Minister. Again, so many parts of this bill have been left up to regulation. We're writing the Minister a blank cheque to decide what he sees fit to do with students' money. So what we have is a problem that most institutions in their submissions said doesn't exist, which the regulatory impact statement said doesn't exist, that goes against the institutional independence which we hold dear in our institutions. It's going to see worse outcomes for a student. It avoids the real issue and once again puts so much power on the shoulders of one man, the Tertiary Education Minister. So in a time when we desperately need education to be providing a boost to our economy and our society, we're seeing unfunding of tertiary education, we're seeing less places provided, we're seeing more expensive services, we're seeing reduced access to over 55-year-old students, we're seeing shocking retrospective punitive decisions ruling out literally thousands of students because the government made changes that apply to 2 years ago. We're seeing raising entry requirements. In a sense, what we're seeing is a whole bunch of barriers to better tertiary education outcomes. We're seeing tertiary education in New Zealand becoming less accessible, less affordable, and in some cases downright impossible as they close the door. Mr. Speaker, that's why the Green Party will be opposing this bill. We would have preferred to have seen those clauses 25 to 29 removed. Then we could have seen all of Parliament voting for this. As it stands, this bill isn't needed, is avoidable, and ignores the real issues facing our sector. Kia ora.
Mr. Speaker, I call Colin King.